Because I am a cook who works an hour away from my house, I spend an immense amount of time thinking about fictional characters and stories during both my car ride and in between shits. While I think there is far more to talk about in later games, I wanted to cover the 4 Warriors of Light. I talked a little bit about them in my Final Fantasy I video, however, that was mostly in regards to how little character they actually have. Upon doing more research into the hero's journey for my Final Fantasy IV video, and an even deeper look into it for some other character essays I'm working on, I realized that the 4 Warriors of Light do follow an overarching narrative of development that lays some of the groundwork for character arcs we see later in the series. Rather than the actual 12 steps of the hero's journey, I believe Final Fantasy I follows the 3 phases of it: separation, initiation, and return. The separation entails that our characters essentially are thrust from their day-to-day lives and embark on their journey. The separation in Final Fantasy I is seen at the very beginning of the game, when the heroes learn of the prophecy that surrounds the crystals they possess, or the prophecy of the 4 Warriors of Light. Despite being born to the legacy of being great heroes and saviors of the world, our party starts off as mere travelers. When they happen to stumble upon the kingdom of Cornelia, they learn of the prophecy surrounding them and their connection with the crystals, essentially their task of vanquishing the 4 fiends and restoring light to the mother crystals with the crystals we possess. And thus, our heroes are thrust from their day-to-day existence and into the roles of living legends, the destiny they are supposed to take. In order to save Princess Sarah, we need to fight a man named Garland, an ex-knight of Cornelia and a manipulator of time. Garland acts as the sign of ultimate enlightenment. Despite the interaction seeming to be of little consequence, he is ultimately what kickstarts our journey onwards, and ultimately, he's the end of it too. There are 2 main points afterwards that I think see our heroes throughout this phase, that being the trial of Bahamut and the actual final boss against Garland himself. First, we will turn our attention to the trial of Bahamut. Essentially, in order to ascend our characters to their final phase prior to the final boss fight, we first need to bring back a rat's tail to Bahamut to prove our worthiness. A fun little info dump I wanted to share while I was doing my beepity-boop-boop research. Bahamut in Final Fantasy is known by many names. However, he is almost always depicted as the father of summons, icons, eidolons, or whatever they happen to be called in that game, as well as, more consistently, the king of dragons. It is pretty well known by now that Final Fantasy I takes heavy inspiration from D&D, and as Bahamut appears in D&D as the god of dragons, it makes sense that our Bahamut would take on a similar role. However, in terms of real-world inspiration, in Arabic cosmography, Bahamut is noted as a giant fish that acts as a layer that supports the earth. Bahamut is known by many different names across translations and different groups, up to and including Bahamut, Bahamut, Balhut, and one more name thought to be derived from the biblical behemoth, and it is translated as such by some scholars, although the behemoth in the Bible is not a fish. The earliest mentions of Bahamut come from the Lives of Prophets, and in the one written by the guy whose name is on the screen, who I don't want to butcher, it is said that God created a large fish, which is a huge whale whose name is Lutia, by name Balhut, and nickname Bahamut. And as such, Lutia, or Leviathan, is Bahamut's earliest name. I find mythology to be very interesting, especially when it's applied in the context of analyzing news stories, so I found all of this to be very cool. However, at the risk of boring you, I didn't want to go off on a long side tangent, so most of what I said can be read and fact-checked from the websites I link below, and if you're really interested, I recommend scrolling to the bottom of the Wikipedia page for Bahamut and checking out some of the sources cited, because there is a lot of info, and it's pretty interesting. And that brings us to side tangent number 2, the rat tail itself. So I mentioned in one of my videos somewhere that I thought the rat tail must have some symbolism behind it, considering it was often used as a token of strength in early Final Fantasy games. However, being a Westerner, as well as cooking for a living, means that I have a pretty negative view of rodents and typically only associate them with being dirty or sneaky or dishonest, which obviously doesn't really mesh with the whole leveling up your characters thing. So I did a little tiny deep dive into some other cultures, and I found that in Chinese culture they actually represent good fortune, and in indigenous culture rats are associated with death and rebirth. And I think it's really cool that the game managed to make all three views relevant at once, because not only is the rat tail referenced as an object that appears to be of little value or use, thus being dirty, but it also brings about a new beginning for our characters, rebirth, and that's certainly good fortune because that allows them to complete their goal. So regardless of how you look at the rat's tail, it applies, and I thought that was cool. So, to summarize that long tangent, Bahamut, the god of dragons, grants our heroes the strength needed to achieve enlightenment and fulfill their destiny, and that brings us to our fight against Garland himself. At the bottom of the Chaos Shrine is where we truly understand what is going on. We learn of Garland's time loop and how it is causing our world to come to harm over and over again. And thus, at the end of our journey, we need to put a stop to it. And we do. So, this should be where we enter our third phase of the hero's journey, return. This point is when our heroes should have shared their discoveries with the rest of humanity. However, they never do, at least not in a physical sense. With the breaking of the time loop, our heroes are forgotten. The chain of events is forgotten, and thus there is never a tangible conclusion for our heroes. And that is exactly what I think makes the story so compelling. The world is saved and your destiny is fulfilled. This should be a happy conclusion, but it's still tinged with that melancholic feeling, like the realization that the journey might as well not have happened at all, and didn't happen at all in the minds of anyone. And that just sends my brain off into all these considerations of the fact that when our heroes return to their time, Garland is still there with Queen Jane and Princess Sarah, as if nothing had ever happened at all. Do they even remember the struggle? And if they do, how did that affect them? Really, the only thing we know for sure is that their memory is preserved in folktales and legends. And that really plays into the whole fact that the Warriors of Light are meant to be you yourself. The game is essentially telling you that only you really remember what happened. It's amazing how so many stories can be broken down following such a similar model as the hero's journey, one that has been around since the dawn of storytelling, and yet even the simplest twist to one aspect of it can make a story more memorable, and I think Final Fantasy I achieves that in the bittersweet perversion of its conclusion. And with that, I bid you good night. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.